June 15th, 1944, Pacific Theatre. The metal door of the transport ship creaked open, revealing a blinding slice of Hawaiian sunlight. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto squinted as he shuffled forward with the other prisoners, the salt-crusted chains around his wrists biting into skin, already raw from 19 days at sea. Behind him, 37 other Japanese soldiers captured during the Battle of Saipan moved in synchronized caution, each man certain they were walking toward their execution. None would admit it, but each secretly hoped American bullets would be quicker than the shame of continuing to live as captives. They were, after all, the dishonored, men who had failed in their duty to die for the Emperor rather than surrender. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men were about to experience would shatter their most fundamental beliefs about their enemy and themselves, triggering a psychological transformation so profound that many would later struggle to explain it to families who could never understand why they had returned from war alive. "Move along! Keep moving!" barked Sergeant Robert Miller, a barrel-chested Marine from Nebraska who had fought at Guadalcanal and now supervised prisoner processing at the newly constructed Camp Honouliuli on Oahu. He gestured with his clipboard rather than a weapon, something Lieutenant Yamamoto immediately noticed. 2 armed guards stood nearby, but their rifles remained slung over their shoulders, not pointed at prisoners as expected. Yamamoto exchanged glances with Corporal Shigeru Tanaka beside him, both men confused by this first deviation from the brutal treatment they had been prepared for since basic training. Captain William Harrison observed the new arrivals from the shade of a nearby administration building. At 43, he was older than most officers in the Pacific Theatre, having joined the Army after a career as a cultural anthropology professor at Berkeley. His unique background had landed him this unusual assignment, developing rehabilitation protocols for Japanese POWs that might yield intelligence and, perhaps more importantly, challenge the fanatical resistance that was costing so many lives on both sides. "They look worse than the last bunch," said Lieutenant David Cohen, the camp's medical officer, joining Harrison on the porch. 19 days in the transport hold will do that, I suppose." "It's more than that," replied Harrison, watching Yamamoto carefully. "Look at the tall one in front. An officer, clearly. See how he's scanning everything? He's looking for the torture chambers, the execution grounds. Finding none, he's more unsettled than if he had." Cohen nodded. "Psychological warfare without firing a shot." "Not warfare," Harrison corrected. "Psychological rescue. There's a difference. These men have been fed lies their entire military careers. Reality itself will be our most powerful weapon." Inside the processing center, Staff Sergeant Maria Gutierrez, one of the 6 Nisei interpreters assigned to Camp Honouliuli, stepped forward. Her family had immigrated from Japan when she was just 4 years old, and now she found herself in the surreal position of translating for men who would have considered her a traitor. "You will now be registered as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention," she explained in flawless Japanese. "You will receive medical attention, food, and quarters. You will not be harmed." Yamamoto stared at her with undisguised contempt. A woman, an American in Japanese skin, speaking to him with authority. It was as if the Americans had carefully calculated each element to maximize the insult. "We require no special treatment," he replied stiffly. "According to Senjin-kun, we should already be dead. Do what you will." Gutierrez translated this for Sergeant Miller, who merely shrugged. "Tell him that's not how we do things here. Process him like the others." The registration proceeded methodically. Each man was photographed, fingerprinted, and issued a numbered identification card. When asked their names, 13 of the 38 refused to answer, giving only their service numbers. This had been expected. Captain Harrison's research had indicated that approximately 40% of Japanese prisoners initially refused identification beyond military details. 34, 2% in this group, slightly below average. Following processing, the men were led to the medical examination area. This was where the first major challenge to their worldview would occur, and Harrison watched carefully through a window from an adjacent office. "Remove your clothes for delousing and medical examination," Gutierrez instructed. The prisoners hesitated, looking to Yamamoto, who stood rigid with shock. In Japanese military training, they had been told Americans collected Japanese bodies for medical experimentation. Now, they were being asked to strip naked, confirming their worst fears. "This is where they harvest our organs," whispered Corporal Tanaka. "They will take our livers while we are still alive." Yamamoto said nothing, but his eyes hardened. He would face death with dignity. Slowly, he began to unbutton his filthy uniform jacket. The others followed suit. Dr. Cohen entered with 2 medical corpsmen, all wearing white coats. "Please inform them that we will be checking for lice, infectious diseases, and treating any wounds," he said to Gutierrez. "Some may need vaccines if their records show they haven't received them." As the examinations began, the prisoners' tension was palpable. Each flinched at the touch of the stethoscope, expecting pain that never came. When Cohen cleaned and bandaged an infected shrapnel wound on Tanaka's shoulder, the corporal stared in disbelief. "Why?" he finally asked in halting English. Cohen looked up, surprised. "Why what?" "Why fix enemy?" the doctor continued, wrapping the bandage. "Because you're hurt, and you're not my enemy anymore. You're my patient." When Gutierrez translated this, several prisoners exchanged glances. Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura, the oldest among them at 36, frowned deeply. This contradicted everything they had been taught. American doctors were supposed to be monsters who performed vivisections and collected Japanese skulls as trophies. There were photographs in their training manuals proving this. Yet here was one treating their wounds with the same care he would presumably show his own men. After medical processing, each man was issued a clean set of clothes, simple khaki shirts and pants with PW stenciled on the back, but of better quality than many had worn in months of jungle fighting. The fabric felt strange against skin, accustomed to rags, stiff with sweat and dirt. "Now you will shower," announced Gutierrez. The men were led to a long building with multiple shower heads protruding from a central pipe. Steam rose from the far end, where other prisoners were already washing. Lieutenant Yamamoto stopped at the doorway, causing those behind him to halt as well. His mind raced. This must be the gas chamber disguised as a bathhouse. He had heard of such things in training. The Americans and British luring prisoners with the promise of cleanliness, only to poison them with deadly gas once inside. "It is a trap," he said quietly to the others. "They intend to execute us all at once." Sergeant Miller noticed the hold-up and approached. "Problem?" he asked Gutierrez. After a brief exchange, she turned to Miller with an unexpected smile. "They think it's a gas chamber." Miller stared for a moment, then to everyone's surprise, let out a booming laugh. "A gas chamber? Jesus Christ!" He walked past the prisoners directly into the shower room, turned a handle, and let water splash over his uniform sleeve. "Tell them it's just water, hot water. Probably the first hot shower they've had since leaving Japan." When Gutierrez translated, the prisoners remained unconvinced. Miller sighed, then did something that would later be recorded in Captain Harrison's behavioral notes as a pivotal moment. He removed his uniform shirt, kicked off his boots, and stepped fully clothed under one of the shower heads, letting the water soak him completely. "See, just water. Now get in here and clean yourselves up. You all stink to high heaven." The demonstration broke the tension. One by one, the prisoners entered the shower room, approaching the falling water with ritual caution before finally stepping beneath it. The sensation of hot water, truly hot, not the lukewarm rain barrel wash they occasionally managed in the field, was overwhelming. Private First Class Kenji Watanabe, at 19, the youngest of the group, couldn't suppress a gasp of pleasure as months of grime began to dissolve from his skin. He had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy at 17, served on a destroyer until it was sunk at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and then been reassigned to a Marine unit on Saipan. In 2 years of service, he had never experienced a proper hot shower. "It feels like the bathhouse in my village," he whispered to no one in particular. For Corporal Ichiro Sato, a farmer's son from Hokkaido, the comparison was different. "It reminds me of standing beneath the waterfall where my father and I used to fish," he said, closing his eyes. "I never thought I would feel clean again." Lieutenant Yamamoto remained stoic, but even he could not deny the simple pleasure of hot water against his skin. The Americans had calculated well, he thought, breaking them down not with pain, but with kindness. A subtle form of torture in its way, designed to soften their resistance. He would need to warn the men. Meanwhile, Captain Harrison was recording his observations. First exposure to American hygiene facilities produces marked disorientation. Subjects expected either execution or, at minimum, cold water and harsh treatment. The provision of hot showers creates cognitive dissonance between expected cruelty and experienced comfort. Note, Sergeant Miller's impromptu demonstration more effective than planned orientation. Consider incorporating similar proof-of-safety demonstrations in future processing. After showering, the prisoners were led to the mess hall. Here again, their expectations were upended. Rather than the gruel or rotten food they had been told would be their fate, each man received a tray containing a substantial meal, a pork cutlet, white rice, vegetables, and even a small slice of pineapple cake. Sergeant Nakamura stared at his tray. The portion was larger than what he had received as a 3-day ration during the final weeks on Saipan. The food itself was of higher quality than what he had eaten in months. "It is poisoned," declared Private Matsuo Hayashi, pushing his tray away slightly. "They fatten us up to experiment on us." Yamamoto picked up his chopsticks. Actual wooden chopsticks, not the metal spoons they had expected. "If they wanted us dead, they could have shot us on the beach," he reasoned quietly. "There would be no need for poison." Across the room, American mess staff and guards ate identical meals at their own tables. Seeing this, the prisoners gradually began to eat. The taste of fresh food after months of near starvation was overwhelming. Private Watanabe had to fight back tears as he ate his first full meal since leaving Japan. Captain Harrison watched from the doorway, conferring quietly with Camp Commander Colonel James Fletcher. "How long before they start talking?" asked Fletcher. "That's not how this works," replied Harrison. "We're not breaking them down to build them back up like our own troops in basic training. We're introducing a reality that contradicts everything they've been told about us. Right now, they're struggling to reconcile this contradiction. Some will decide it's an elaborate deception. Others will begin to question everything they've been taught. And that's when they'll give us useful intelligence?" Harrison shook his head. "Some will, yes. But the larger victory is dismantling the ideology that makes them fight to the death rather than surrender. Every Japanese soldier who becomes willing to lay down arms rather than die needlessly saves American lives too." The colonel nodded slowly. "The War Department gives me reports on the kill ratios at Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok. For every one of our boys killed, we're killing 20, 30 Japanese. But they just won't quit. If you can change that equation even slightly." "That's the idea, but it takes time." After the meal, the prisoners were shown to their barracks. Simple but clean, with individual cots, blankets, and even small footlockers for personal belongings, though few had any possessions remaining. As night fell, Lieutenant Yamamoto gathered the men in his section of the barracks. Despite being watched by guards and presumably listened to by interpreters, he felt compelled to address the confusion he saw in his men's eyes. "Do not be deceived by American tricks," he said in a low voice. "They treat us well now to lower our guard, to make us compliant. Remember your training, name, rank, number, nothing more." Corporal Tanaka nodded firmly, but some others seemed less convinced. Private Watanabe looked down at his hands, now clean for the first time in months. "With respect, Lieutenant," ventured Sergeant Nakamura, "I have been fighting since Manchuria in '37. I have seen how we treat Chinese prisoners. This is different." "Different methods, same objective," insisted Yamamoto. "They seek information, cooperation. We will give them neither." The conversation ended as an American guard passed by, but the seeds of doubt had been planted in both directions. Yamamoto realized maintaining unit discipline would be challenging under these conditions. The Americans were using comfort as a weapon more potent than any torture. The next morning brought further shocks. After breakfast, the prisoners were divided into work details. Not the brutal labor camps they had expected, but ordinary maintenance tasks around the camp. Lieutenant Yamamoto and 5 others were assigned to the camp garden, where they would grow vegetables to supplement the camp meals. Captain Harrison had specifically requested Yamamoto for this detail, recognizing the officer as both a challenge and an opportunity. If the lieutenant's resistance could be overcome, others would follow. The garden supervisor was Technical Sergeant Paul Martinez, a Mexican-American from California who had worked on his family's farm before the war. Speaking through Gutierrez, he explained the work matter-of-factly, demonstrating how to prepare soil for planting. "The soil here is different from Japan," he noted. "More volcanic. Good for some crops, challenging for others." Yamamoto was surprised by Martinez's knowledge of Japanese agriculture. "You have been to Japan?" he asked despite himself. "No," replied Martinez through the interpreter, "but I studied Asian farming techniques in college. Your terraced rice paddies are engineering marvels." This casual compliment to Japanese methods caught Yamamoto off guard. In his training, Americans had been portrayed as ignorant barbarians with no appreciation for Japanese culture or achievements. As they worked, more contradictions accumulated. The prisoners were given water breaks hourly. They were provided proper tools. When Private Hayashi accidentally broke a hoe handle, he braced for punishment, only to have Martinez simply bring him a replacement without comment. By mid-afternoon, as they took a brief rest in the shade, Corporal Tanaka could no longer contain his confusion. "Lieutenant," he whispered to Yamamoto, "why do they treat us this way? It makes no sense." Before Yamamoto could answer, they were interrupted by an unexpected arrival. Captain Harrison approached with a middle-aged Japanese man in civilian clothes, Isamu Noguchi, a renowned Japanese-American sculptor who was voluntarily living at the internment camp to improve conditions for Japanese-American internees. Harrison had invited him to speak with the POWs as part of his cultural reorientation program. Through Gutierrez, Noguchi spoke briefly about his life straddling 2 cultures, his work in America and his visits to Japan. He answered questions with a frankness that stunned the prisoners, including his criticism of certain American policies alongside his condemnation of Japanese militarism. "Both our countries have made terrible mistakes," he said. "But there is a difference. In America, I can say this openly without fear. Can you say the same of Japan today?" After Noguchi departed, the prisoners worked in silence, each wrestling with their thoughts. For many, this was the first encounter with a Japanese person who had freely chosen America, not as a place of exile, but as a home where he could criticize yet still belong. That evening, as Yamamoto lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, He found himself unable to maintain the certainty he had felt just 24 hours earlier. The Americans were nothing like he had been taught. They provided food, shelter, medical care, and dignified work. They allowed a Japanese American to speak freely, even critically. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to see the Japanese prisoners not as animals or demons, but as human beings who happened to be enemies. Across the barracks, similar thoughts troubled other prisoners. Private Watanabe had been caught stealing an extra roll at dinner, an act for which he would have been severely beaten in a Japanese camp. The American server had simply smiled and given him another, saying through the interpreter, "Growing boy needs to eat." This small kindness had nearly broken him. The psychological effect of these accumulated contradictions was exactly what Captain Harrison had anticipated. In his evening report he noted, "Day 2 shows expected patterns of cognitive dissonance. Subjects are attempting to reconcile observed American behavior with indoctrinated expectations. Primary response remains suspicion of ulterior motives, but seeds of doubt are clearly present. Lieutenant Y, subject known 4173, shows particular resistance, but also curiosity. Recommend continued focus on this subject as potential opinion leader." The following days brought more revelations. The prisoners were permitted to send and receive mail, heavily censored, of course. They were given access to books, newspapers, and even occasional films. Most shocking of all, they were paid for their work, according to the Geneva Convention. Small amounts, but actual wages that could be used at the camp canteen for personal items. During the 3rd week of captivity, an incident occurred that would permanently alter many prisoners' perspectives. Private Hayashi developed appendicitis, requiring emergency surgery. In the pre-dawn hours, he was rushed to the camp hospital, where Dr. Cohen performed the operation. Lieutenant Yamamoto and Sergeant Nakamura were permitted to wait nearby, a courtesy that astonished them. "In our army," whispered Nakamura, "a common soldier would be given morphine and left to die if we were in a combat situation." "We are not in combat," replied Yamamoto, but the point remained. The Americans were expending considerable resources to save the life of a single enemy soldier of no particular importance. After the successful surgery, Dr. Cohen explained the procedure to them through Gutierrez. "He'll need to rest for about 2 weeks, but he'll make a complete recovery." "Why did you save him?" Yamamoto finally asked the question that had been troubling him for weeks. "Obi is an enemy. We would have let your men die." Cohen considered this for a moment. "Because that's the difference I'm fighting for," he said simply. "If I treated your men the way you say you'd treat mine, what would I be fighting to preserve?" This exchange was reported to Captain Harrison, who recognized it as a breakthrough moment. In his notes, he wrote, "Subject 4173, Litu. Y has reached the critical comparison stage, directly contrasting American medical treatment with Japanese practices. The question itself represents significant progress from initial defensive posture. Ethical contradictions are now explicitly acknowledged rather than rationalized." The most dramatic moment came 6 weeks into their captivity. A new group of prisoners arrived, including 3 who had been captured alongside Yamamoto's group but sent to a different processing center first. The reunited men exchanged experiences, with the newcomers expressing disbelief at the conditions described at Camp Honolulu. "It must be only this camp," insisted Second Lieutenant Hiroki Ito, one of the newcomers, "a showcase to trick international Red Cross inspectors. The other Americans cannot be like this." "It was the same at Camp Iroquois," countered Private Watanabe, now significantly healthier and more confident than when he had arrived. "Perhaps what we were told about Americans was not entirely accurate." "Careful, Watanabe," warned Lieutenant Ito. "Such talk borders on treason." Is it treason to speak the truth of what I have seen with my own eyes? Watanabe shot back, surprising himself with his boldness. For 6 weeks, I have watched and waited for the Americans to reveal their true nature. I have seen only consistency. Lieutenant Yamamoto, listening nearby, found himself unable to rebuke Watanabe as he once would have. The young private was simply stating facts that Yamamoto himself could no longer deny. The Americans had demonstrated a system of treatment that contradicted everything in Japanese military doctrine. The argument might have escalated further had it not been interrupted by an extraordinary announcement. The prisoners were being given permission to swim at a supervised beach area, a recreational privilege unheard of in their concept of captivity. At the beach, under guard but with remarkable freedom of movement within the designated area, many of the men experienced their first moment of genuine joy since capture. For Private Watanabe and others from coastal villages, the familiar embrace of the ocean was a powerful reminder of home. Even Lieutenant Yamamoto, who had maintained his rigid discipline, found himself floating on his back, staring at the vast Hawaiian sky. A memory surfaced, swimming in Tokyo Bay as a child, his father calling from shore. Before the war, before the training that had shaped him into a weapon, before he had learned to see Americans as subhuman enemies rather than people like himself. Captain Harrison observed from the shore, noting the relaxed body language and spontaneous interaction among prisoners who had previously maintained formal military bearing at all times. His experiment was working, by contradicting Japanese propaganda, not with counter-propaganda, but with direct experience. He was effectively reprogramming their understanding of the conflict and their place within it. That evening, Lieutenant Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his captivity. A representative from the International Red Cross was visiting the camp and had asked to interview several prisoners privately about their treatment. Yamamoto had been selected as one of these interviewees. Imperial Japanese Army regulations were clear. If captured, a soldier should provide only name, rank, and number, then seek the earliest opportunity for honorable suicide. Any cooperation with the enemy beyond these minimums was betrayal. Yet Yamamoto now found himself questioning whose interests would truly be served by maintaining this rigid stance. In the privacy of the Red Cross interview, Yamamoto made his choice. He provided a detailed, truthful account of his treatment at Camp Honouliuli. He described the initial shock of humane treatment, the gradual realization that American actions consistently contradicted Japanese propaganda, and his own evolving understanding of the war. We were told Americans would torture us, experiment on us, execute us, he explained to the Swiss representative. Instead, they have treated us according to laws they call the Geneva Convention. They have provided food, medical care, and dignified conditions I did not expect. When asked if he had any complaints, Yamamoto hesitated, then shook his head. My complaint is with those who sent us to fight without telling us the truth about our enemy. Had I known Americans treated prisoners this way, perhaps more of my men would have surrendered rather than fighting to the death on Saipan. This statement, recorded in the Red Cross report and eventually reaching the desks of military planners in Washington, would be cited as evidence of the effectiveness of Captain Harrison's approach. In the months that followed, the transformation among the prisoners continued. Some, like Lieutenant Ito, maintained rigid resistance, refusing to acknowledge anything positive about American methods. Others, like Private Watanabe, embraced the opportunity to learn English and American customs, perhaps already thinking about life after the war. Lieutenant Yamamoto charted a middle course, maintaining his dignity as a Japanese officer, while accepting the reality of his situation and the contradictions it revealed about his training. When given the opportunity to participate in a radio broadcast to other Japanese troops encouraging surrender, he declined. That would be a step too far. But neither did he discourage the 7 men from his original group who chose to participate. By December 1944, Camp Honolulu had processed over 3,000 Japanese POWs with results that defied pre-war expectations. Intelligence gathered from willing prisoners had saved American lives. Psychological profiles developed by Captain Harrison and his team were helping combat units understand the mindset of their opponents. Most significantly, as word spread through covert prisoner communications networks about the true nature of American captivity, surrender rates began to increase slightly, not dramatically, but enough to be statistically significant. On April 5, 1945, Lieutenant Yamamoto was called to Captain Harrison's office. There, he learned he was being transferred to a special facility in Maryland, where his language skills and cooperating with American intelligence officers. Though he had never provided tactical information about Japanese forces, his willingness to explain cultural concepts and military psychology had proven valuable. "You have a choice, Lieutenant," Harrison explained through an interpreter. "You can decline this transfer and remain here with your men, but I believe you could help save lives, both American and Japanese, by helping us understand each other better." Yamamoto was silent for a long moment, thinking of the journey that had brought him here. From absolute certainty in Japan's divine mission, to the shock of capture, to the slow, painful recognition that much of what he had been taught was false. The Americans were not the demons of propaganda. They were human beings fighting for their own understanding of what was right, just as he had been. "I will go," he said finally. "Not to betray my country, but perhaps to serve it in a different way. The war is lost. Japan will need men who understand America when it is over." Captain Harrison nodded. "That's exactly why I recommended you for this posting." As he left the office, Yamamoto passed a window overlooking the shower building where, 10 months earlier, he had stood frozen in fear, certain he was being led to execution. New prisoners were entering now, their faces showing the same terror and confusion he had felt. He watched an American sergeant, not Miller, someone new, demonstrate by walking fully clothed into the shower, exactly as Miller had done for Yamamoto's group. Some things had not changed. The war continued. Men still fought and died on islands with unfamiliar names. But other things had changed profoundly. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, once prepared to die rather than surrender, now walked toward a future he could never have imagined, carrying with him the lesson that had begun with an American shower, that humanity could survive even in the midst of the most inhumane conflict the world had ever known. After the war, of the 38 men in Yamamoto's original group, 35 would return to Japan. Many would face ostracism and suspicion for having survived captivity. Yet as Japan rebuilt in the post-war years, their experience with Americans would prove unexpectedly valuable. Private Kenji Watanabe would become an English teacher. Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura would work as a cultural liaison for American businesses, establishing offices in Tokyo. And Lieutenant Yamamoto himself would eventually serve as an advisor to the new Japanese self-defense forces, helping to build a relationship between former enemies that would have seemed impossible on that June day when he first encountered an American shower and thought it was a trap. Captain William Harrison's methods would be studied and refined throughout the remainder of the Pacific War and into the Cold War era, establishing principles of psychological operations that emphasize truth over propaganda, direct experience over indoctrination, and human dignity over degradation. His final report would conclude, "The most effective weapon against fanaticism is not counter-fanaticism, but the simple, consistent demonstration of an alternative reality." When faced with a choice between what they have been told and what they have experienced firsthand, human beings will eventually trust their experience. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time,